Hi, this is Bastiaan, and today we're going to see how we can play a passive opening more aggressively. And the opening I'm using for this game, which is played against 2000 plus opponents, is the Valencia, which is rarely seen. Valencia starts out with d3, so we're not taking control of the center. e5, black may reply with d5 as well. Won't matter much. And now knight to d2. So this is the Valencia developing the two pieces on the passive square. Black plays d5, a common reply, developing both pawns and taking control of the center. Now knight g to f3, attacking the pawn on e5, and black plays knight to c6, protecting that pawn. So 9 times out of 10 this will be the setup to that we see with the Valencia opening. Now to continue our attack we may play b3 in order to fianchetto and add more pressure on the pawn on e5. But an aggressive alternative is to play b4 instead. And this seems like an illogical move because the pawn is under attack twice by the bishop and the knight. But we can see already that the knight cannot recapture. Otherwise, we can destroy black's center and take on the pawn on e5. So bishop to b4 is played. So we're losing the pawn at this point. But it is somehow like a queen's gambit. We are not really losing the pawn, and it will be impossible for black to hold on to his extra pawn. Our idea is to fianchetto to b2 and create an attack on e5 to recapture our pawn. So bishop to b2 is played, and in order to save his pawn, black may try a few variations. He may play e4, attacking the knight, but we can see that the pawn on g7 is unprotected, so we can recapture that pawn. Furthermore, we can see that black's rook is lost. So advancing the pawn is not an option. Alternatively, black may try d4, blocking the diagonal of the b2 bishop. And now white may continue with queen to c1 in order to push the c3 pawn and capture the d4 pawn, which will leave the e5 pawn undefended. So if black continues with, say, knight to f6, c3, black may exchange. So we are recreating our attack on the e5 pawn. Bishop recaptures and queen recaptures, and now the queen is being used as a bishop, renewing the attack on the e5 pawn. So black may castle, I can take on the pawn. Black may recapture and I can take on the knight, and we can see that our material is once again equal. So this may not be the best continuation, but it shows that it will prove to be impossible for black to hold on to the pawn in these variations. Black tries a third approach to save his pawn and plays queen to e7. We can see that the pawn is protected by the queen and the knight on c6. We continue with a3, chasing away the bishop. Bishop captures the knight. Queen recaptures. Now bishop to g4. The reason why bishop to g4 is played is to eliminate one attacker. Black isn't sure how to proceed against this opening and wants to keep his material advantage, and in order to do so he would like to exchange minor pieces and go to an endgame one pawn up. So I play h3, challenging the bishop. Black takes on the knight and I recapture. So we're seeing that black has a pawn island in the center. He has an advantage of one pawn in material, and I'm having double pawns on the f-file. Black continues with knight to f6, and it shows like black has done nothing wrong. He can not only castle queenside but kingside as well, and he has a very typical setup with both knights developed and a pawn center. I play f4, trying to solve my problem of the double pawns. Now, if black were to recapture, I could play queen to f4, so I no longer have double pawns, and I have a very powerful queen in the center, and it's not easy to get rid of this queen. For instance, if knight to h5 were to be played, I can play queen to g4, forking the knight on h5 and the pawn on g7. So if g6 is played to protect the knight, we can see that his rook on h8 is lost. So recapturing is probably a bad idea for black. This move wasn't played, and black instead plays e4. So I'm still left with my double pawns. I continue with rook to g1, taking advantage of the half-open file, threatening the pawn on g7. Black castles kingside to prevent that threat. I grab the pawn, and now you can see that white has two pawn islands in the center, and there are three ways for black to recapture the pawn, or he must give back my pawn. So let's see which option is best. If knight takes, I can play rook takes pawn check, king to h8 forced, rook takes pawn check, threatening the queen, king goes back to g8, and black loses the queen. Now black may recapture the rook, but then I can play queen to d4, threatening the mate on g7 and threatening the knight and pawn in some other cases. So recapturing with the knight is a bad choice for black. Finally, queen can recapture, or secondly, queen can recapture, but then we can see there is no protection on the knight on f6, because this pawn is needed to block the check. So simply bishop takes, and black is down a minor piece. And the third option, if black wants to hold on to the pawn, is to recapture with his own pawn. I still have the double pawns, and black still has the material advantage of one pawn. And it's very typical when your opponent doesn't know how to deal with an opening, is to try and hold on to a material advantage, and he probably should have played differently, because black is in a lost position already. Queen goes to c3. Now let's see what the threat is. If, say, a random move is played, a6, I can take on the knight, queen recaptures, and bishop captures. And of course the bishop cannot be recaptured because of the threat of the check. I can continue my attack with pushing the h-pawn. So black is down a minor piece. It's not necessarily the best continuation, but already winning for white and very simple to see. If not a random move is played, but the knight is moved out of the way, of course we can crash through with rook to g7. We see that the knight is defending that square, so knight recaptures, queen recaptures, checkmate. So moving the knight is impossible. King to h8 is played instead. I crashed through anyways. Rook takes pawn on g7, and the reason why is that this strips a defender of the weak knight on f6. So the king grabs the rook, so I've lost the rook for a pawn, and the king is now defending the knight on f6 instead of the pawn. So I can't simply recapture the knight yet with the queen, because I will simply lose material. But there is a second attack. Queen to g3 check, again taking advantage of the open file. And the knight cannot block because there is still the pin with this bishop. There are two possibilities. King to h6 will lead to a checkmate immediately, so that cannot be played. King is forced back to h8. Queen to g5, pressuring the knight on f6. Now, if the queen moves out of the defense of the knight, we can get a checkmate immediately. If queen goes to e6, protecting the knight, I can take on the knight with check, forcing queen takes bishop and queen takes queen check, which will lead to a one game for white. Instead, black tries rook to e8, giving more space for the king, and black realizes his minor piece on f6 is now lost. There's no way to save it, so bishop takes, check, forking queen and king. Queen recaptures, queen takes queen check, king to g8. I castle queenside, rook is to the open file, rook a to d8, queen to g5 check, king to f8, using the square on f8, f5. So now I'm trying to mate my opponent with pawn and queen combination. If rook to e5 is played to stop the pawn advance, I can grab the rook on d8, knight can recapture, and I can grab the knight, so this is losing for black. So it's very difficult for black to stop the pawn advance. He can try f6, but then queen takes pawn check, king to g8, rook takes rook, rook recaptures, and now e3 to develop the bishop will lead to a forced mate for black. Black exchanges instead, rook takes rook, king recaptures, rook to d8 check, king to c1, rook to d5, trying to block the pawn advance with the rook on d5 instead of e5. But now bishop to g2, threatening the pawn with the discovered attack on the rook, a discovered attack on the knight, and a discovered attack on the final pawn on b7. So a very powerful move. Rook to e5 instead, attacking the pawn on f5 and still protecting the pawn on e4. Queen to h6 check, a move with tempo. King to e8, queen takes pawn. There's no tempo in this move, but we're still protecting, or are once again protecting the pawn on f5, and we're looking for a check on h8 with tempo, which will lose the rook. King to e7, bishop takes pawn. It looks like the bishop is sacrificed, so rook takes bishop, but now f6 check, king recaptures, and black loses the rook, and at this point my opponent resigned the game. So this game shows you that it is possible to find moves in passive openings, to get a more aggressive game and to throw your opponent off balance without a clear idea how to play against it. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Thanks for watching, please leave a comment and have a great evening.